Can you smell the sweet bread baking? My mother-in-law had 10 children, and it took one loaf of bread to make toast for breakfast. At least a second loaf for the sandwiches for the lunch boxes. And then afternoon snacks were often a piece of bread with peanut butter and jelly on it to tide everyone over until dinner. The family didn't have a lot of money, but they needed a lot of bread. So often Dad would stop by the bread outlet in Medford on the way home and buy a big armful of day-old loaves. Or Mom would watch the circulars in the daily paper and see when King Arthur flour was on sale, the best kind for making bread. She'd buy as many 5-pound bags as she could to make bread from scratch, and those were the days the kids loved the most. Now, Mom's bread mixer has been passed down from the triple-decker in Davis Square, Somerville, where she grew up, and each of us, upon a wedding or upon a birthday, hope that we will get a bread mixer of our own. They look like this. And the way you find them is to go to antique stores or somebody's dusty farm and look for it. Here's what you do to make bread. You start by putting hot water in the bottom of the pail, and then you dump in a full stick of butter, and it melts in that heat. Then you take the entire 5-pound bag of flour, one like this, and you put it in, cupful by cupful, along, of course, with the yeast and the salt, and occasionally a bit of honey. Then you need to do the turning. Inside, there's a bread hook. And when you first start mixing up the dough, you turn the handle and things get mixed. But of course, after a while, the mixture begins to be dough-like, and it gets harder and harder to turn, especially because remember, you've used a whole bag, a 5-pound bag of flour. So it was the children who got to do that, kneading the dough over and over. After about 10 minutes, you'd probably be done. There'd be a ball of dough at the very bottom on that hook, and it would be elastic feeling, ready to rise. There was no electricity or batteries used, obviously, just old-fashioned elbow grease. And most days, the children would be the one who would be assigned this task. Some would have to hold the bucket firmly in place, and others would do the turning. When I use a full bag of flour to do this, I have to sit down on the floor of the kitchen and hold this in between my legs so that it doesn't move when I turn it. It's tiring, but we love the end product. Of course, after it has risen, sometimes in the summer it rises so high that this lid actually lifts up a little bit. And then what we do is twist it one more time, which takes the air out, it goes down, and we let it rise a second time, either in the tin or shaping it to put into bread loaves. When the smell of baking bread seeps out from the kitchen, we know that we're going to have 6 or 7 or 8 loaves of bread, maybe large pans of dinner rolls, and on special occasions, some wreaths of braided cinnamon rolls that have nuts and raisins inside and some frosting on top. Jesus asked, "What else is the kingdom of God like?" It's like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put in only a little yeast and 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. You can tell that I love this image. The story would have made the first listeners smile too when they heard it, Jesus talking out on hills and in small gatherings. Bread, the food of life. In Arabic, one ancient term for bread is aish, which also means life. In the Muslim and Jewish worlds, bread is treated with great reverence. A prayer is said before it is broken. But the story would not only have evoked smiles because of that gift of life that bread can give. It also would have made people smile or maybe snort or chortle at the idea that God was anything like a woman doing domestic chores. The kingdom of God is like when a king bakes bread or sweeps the floor or walks the dog. And the kingdom and the king as a woman, double ha. But Jesus was forever subverting the traditional hierarchies. If the holy were indeed within each one of them, his listeners, surrounding and leading them, then the holy needed to be able to be envisioned, not only as regal and afar off, with the majesty with which our choir sang the last piece, but also needed to be a God very close and very familiar, intimate even. The holy had to know and be part of, be mixed in to our everyday life. Yes, God is like a woman who bakes bread. God's energy at work in the world, like one of the common daily ingredients of life, called yeast. But there would be another reason that there would be laughter rippling through Jesus's listeners, because the woman in the story he tells doesn't just dump in a whole 5-pound bag of flour as if that weren't enough. Indeed, he says that the woman dumps in a 50-pound bag of flour. Have you ever seen them at Costco or BJ's? They're this large. Imagine that. Mixing yeast into a 50-pound bag of flour, enough to make 60 or 70 or maybe 100 loaves, not just feeding that big family of 12, but enough to feed a whole village and beyond, enough for a feast. This woman in Jesus' story mixes the same vast amount of flour as Sarah did in our Old Testament reading. Sarah, wife of that revered patriarch Abraham. Remember, Abraham saw 3 strangers approach his tent and in the desert, and he says, oh, may I give you just a little bit of bread, a little meal. And then out of their earshot, he rushes back into the tent and tells Sarah, we must have a lavish feast. Use our whole supply of flour, 50 pounds of the choice amount, to make bread. It's like the day my husband and I showed up as unexpected strangers in Ireland to Mrs. O'Leary's small 3-bedroom house. It's the kind of thing only kids in their 20s would do, as we were. Unannounced, showing up in this little village that was no bigger than a crossroad, introducing ourselves very proudly as her daughter Kathleen's nephew and wife. And so she, being a little older and wiser and knowing the rules of etiquette far better than we, greeted us warmly, had us sit down, provided, of course, some lovely beverages, and then disappeared into the kitchen. And later we learned, ran right out the back door to buy cold cuts and bread for us. Like Abraham rushing right away into that tent to Sarah, quick, we need to feed these visitors. What generosity. All these images of abundance and feasts, Mrs. O'Leary and Sarah and Abraham, the disciples feeding 5,000 with 12 baskets of leftover bread collected. Well, the improbability of all that, the absurdity of using 50 pounds of flour, it would make Jesus' listeners laugh. As crazy an idea as 2 old people beyond the age of being able to conceive, soon birthing a baby. As ludicrous as God growing from Abraham and Sarah, that old couple, has meant people as vast as the grains of sand in the sea, as the stars in the sky, and yet that had been the promise, remember, that God made to Sarah and Abraham. And after those 3 strangers ate their feasting meal, they said God's wild, ludicrous promise to Abraham would be fulfilled. And all those people, many years later, Jesus' listeners, they were proof that it was true. They were the progeny. And now Jesus is making another ludicrous promise to them. This is what God's energy is like in the world. It's like a little bit of yeast, making all 50 pounds of flour rise, God's energy able to course through us, making the improbable possible, giving nourishment and new life. But there was another thought that I think those people out in the field listening might have had that day, another thought that would cross their minds, and that is when they heard about yeast and flour, They might have shifted a bit uneasily. Something would cross their minds as it should cross ours today. You see, Jesus did not use yeast only as a positive image. There were other times and other stories he told when it was seen as a negative force. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, which meant beware of their false teachings. How quickly those false teachings spread and infect so many. You see, there were times in the Jewish year when yeast was not something that just gave life. You remember that during Passover, where the people had come out of Egypt and had bread that was flat and unleavened. They'd had it that way because they had rushed so quickly to get away from Pharaoh. And so during Passover, there'd be unleavened bread, the kind of matzah we see today during Passover times. And so during that very holy time, Jews cleaned all the yeast, all the leaven, all the lumps of starter that you would use for sourdough bread out of their homes. But yeast is one of those things that can remain in the air, the little bacteria that can grow. And so during Passover time, it was something that should be avoided. Even a small amount could infect all the unleavened bread and make it rise. So yeast could give life, and it could be a thing that spreads too wildly and causes havoc. Beware the yeast of the Pharisees, who seem to teach that good law, but then it grows beyond health, imposing legal standards on us that none of us can reach. A good thing to know that we are to love God and love one another turns into a contagion that infects the whole religion, and we're sick and not saved. Or maybe we're told to stand in awe of our Almighty God, the King eternal and immortal, the only wise God, as we say here. But that concept of being awestruck spreads like a negative yeast, and we no longer get to be human with imperfections, but have to declare ourselves always and forever miserable sinners, unable to stand before God. A good notion of God's awesomeness takes on the qualities of a virus, so that too many Christians shame each other mercilessly, attack other religions violently. It spreads like cholera in Hades' water, like sepsis infiltrating a body through a blood infection. Like fear and hatred spreading out among us, hate speech becoming acceptable political rhetoric. No wonder the New York Times reported just a few weeks ago that the number of hate crimes in America has increased exponentially against two groups just this year, against Muslims and against those who are transgender. We've had the most hate crimes against Muslims since the year 2001. 481 documented hate crimes. And of course, that grossly understates the issue because many people will not report it. And yet this is also a time when hate crimes against all other groups have been dropping. What are we to learn? The researchers, the nonpartisan researchers, attribute the spikes to language in our political rhetoric that says Muslims should be not allowed in the country or segregated when they are here. When we have free political speech that is such a good thing, but it has soured into hate speech made acceptable, doesn't it then spread like a cancer through our body politic, metastasizing through the bloodstream of social media, 24-hour cable coverage, infecting how many organs now? Does it infect our brain, infect our heart? Does it enervate our arms that used to reach out and help others? Is it paralyzing our legs that used to raise us up and make us stand tall as moral people? There are no perfect candidates. We need those who are incorruptible, who won't trade our national interest for their personal gain, who admit mistakes, never lie, who don't work hard to hide truth from us voters. We need those who know what it's like to be kicked to the curb, or dedicated to those who are the least and lost and lonely. Friends, what will we let spread amongst us, growing and permeating our nation? Good yeast can bring abundant food to those who are hungry, or will it be yeast of hatred? because we know how good yeast can make an abundant feast beyond imagining, or in the wrong time and way be against our holy words. So this morning, our children helped prepare sandwiches. Just before this service and after this service, we're going to take them down to Boston Common. You're all invited. We're going to be sharing them. The good news is Common Cathedral celebrates its 20th anniversary this year of ministering outdoors every Sunday, feet from this church. So one of our members chances to see a small group of young people, just 13 or 15, not quite grown into their own bodies. And she remembers what it was like to be 13 or 14 or 15. And this person in our church sees these youth who are just trying to have a parade with a little sign that says Bagley, B-A-G-L-Y, Boston Area Gay and Lesbian Youth. And they meet in the basement of a church that's now been closed and sold for condos. But somehow, by the next year, that little group has space at 14 Beacon Street, right a block from here. And someone at King's Chapel suggests that, well, we might give money to that group, just as we did today to Common Cathedral, because it's hard to be a teen. And then maybe a year later, someone suggests we begin marching in the Gay Pride Parade, a few straight people joining others. And then a new young grad student comes in our doors, someone who at her Episcopal church at home always hung around very late after with her mom at the coffee hour, the last to leave, and she starts learning about us. Even before she joins as a member, she is interested in Bagley and focuses on this group. What can we do, really, she asks them, and she goes to their fundraiser. She goes with Sean and with another one of our new members who's come in our doors, and they hear the stories of those kids who've been afraid and sometimes kicked out of their home, and how good it felt to find a place that they can trust. And these few, just 3 or 4 of them in our community, keep showing up. Another person creates an ad to put in their brochure that says, we are one of the few churches that does so, and it says, still making history after all these years. And then time passes, and a few weeks ago, someone in the group right down the hall from Bagley approaches our assistant minister, Sean. Can we help with the effort for those who are transgender, whose rights will be put to a ballot test 2 years from now? Would we be willing to be a place where ministers who support their rights could come and stand here up in front and say, we support all God's children? And so Sean speaks to our senior warden, who says yes. And then we do our research to make sure and learn that ballot initiatives are nonpartisan, so we're allowed to speak out on them. And we know that there is a family here for whom those issues are important, and I have worked with a family in another church who are very worried for their children. And Sean tells us about the danger that those who are transgender are under, the 40% increase in hate crimes this year against them. And our wardens talk to our senior leadership, our council, and our vestry, and they all agree. Then Sean, who's been leading our efforts, needs to be out of town because his grandmother dies. And I learned early this week that ministers haven't been quite all invited yet. And I think, what am I going to do? Because I'm a new minister and I'm not networked as well as I would like to be. How do I invite people to stand here? And I take a deep breath and I think, what would I do if I were not afraid? And I start sending emails and picking up the phone. And I know a few, and they all reach out to those they know. And slowly, this yeast that started when one person looked out her window and saw a little group who seemed to be teenagers trying to stand up for their rights and band together, spread. And we were able to stand for the rights of those who need us to stand with them. There's such opportunity. Yeast that spreads, it can feed the world. We stand on that side or be part of negative yeast that also spreads and can cause great harm.